They laughed when a little girl wandered into that frozen hobbit house on the edge of town, the strange half-buried stone structure everyone said was cursed. But what she and her mother found buried in the tunnels beneath would silence every doubter, expose a 70-year-old secret, and uncover $275 million worth of treasure that powerful people had been searching for since the end of World War II. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The winter wind cut through Frost Ridge, Montana like a blade, sharp enough to steal your breath and freeze the words right out of your mouth. It was the kind of cold that made people walk faster, heads down, focused only on getting from one warm place to another. Nobody lingered. Nobody explored. Nobody, that was, except 9-year-old Emma Hartley. Sarah Hartley watched her daughter from the kitchen window of their rented duplex, the glass fogged with condensation from the ancient radiator that barely worked. Emma was outside again, mittened hands pressed against the chain-link fence that separated their yard from the empty lot beyond. Beyond that lot, maybe 300 yards across the frozen field, sat the thing that had captured Emma's imagination for months. The Hobbit house. That's what Emma called it anyway. To everyone else in Frost Ridge, it was just the old Kellerman place, though nobody alive remembered anyone named Kellerman. The structure was strange, half buried in the hillside like something out of a fairy tale, with a rounded stone facade and a heavy wooden door that faced the wind. Most of it disappeared into the earth behind, swallowed by decades of overgrowth now frozen and brown. The stones were grey and weathered, covered in patches of ice that caught the weak winter sunlight and threw it back in fractured pieces. Sarah had moved to Frost Ridge 8 months ago with nothing but a broken marriage behind her, $300 in her checking account, and a daughter who asked too many questions. The duplex was cheap because it was falling apart. The job at Miller's Auto Repair paid just enough to keep the lights on and cereal in the cupboard. Every night, Sarah lay awake doing math in her head, stretching dollars like taffy, praying they wouldn't snap before the next paycheck. She was 31 years old and felt 50. Her hands were calloused from changing oil and rotating tires. Her back ached from hunching under hoods in the unheated garage bay. She hadn't bought herself new clothes in over a year. But Emma had boots that fit, a warm coat and hot meals. That was what mattered. Sarah pulled on her own coat, a thrift store find with a broken zipper she'd safety pinned closed, and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical thing, stealing her breath. Emma turned at the sound of the door, her face bright despite the frozen air. "Mama, can we go look at it today?" Emma asked, her breath pluming white. "Please, just for a little bit." Sarah glanced at the Hobbit house across the field. She'd been avoiding it deliberately. The town had stories about that place, the kind of stories small towns loved to tell to scare newcomers and entertain themselves during long winters. People said it was cursed. That old man Kellerman had been some kind of recluse who died in there decades ago. That strange lights appeared in the windows on certain nights. That anyone who went inside came out changed, or didn't come out at all. Sarah didn't believe in curses. She'd stopped believing in a lot of things over the past few years, but she did believe in tetanus, unstable structures, and broken glass, and she believed in keeping her daughter safe. "Baby, that place isn't safe," Sarah said, crouching down to Emma's level. "It's old and falling apart. I don't want you getting hurt." Emma's face fell. But what if there's treasure in there? What if it's like in the stories, where the brave people find something amazing that helps them? Sarah's heart squeezed. Emma had been reading fairy tales constantly since the divorce, stories where poor girls became princesses, where magic solved problems, where happy endings were guaranteed. Sarah didn't have the heart to tell her that real life didn't work that way. "Those are just stories, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, tucking a strand of Emma's dark hair back into her knit cap. "In real life, old buildings just have old junk and lots of ways to get hurt." Emma's jaw set in that stubborn way that reminded Sarah painfully of herself. "But we won't know unless we look." That evening, after a dinner of mac and cheese stretched with frozen peas, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills. The heating bill had gone up again. The landlord was threatening to raise the rent. Her car needed new brake pads, and she couldn't afford to fix it even with her employee discount. The numbers swam in front of her eyes, each one a small crisis waiting to happen. She heard Emma in the next room, the tiny second bedroom that barely fit a twin bed and a dresser, reading aloud to herself. Sarah recognized the cadence. It was that same fairy tale again, the one about the girl who found the hidden door that led to a magical kingdom. Sarah pressed her palms against her eyes. She was so tired. Tired of being scared. Tired of counting pennies. Tired of telling Emma no about everything from new crayons to dance classes, to checking out one old abandoned building that probably contained nothing more dangerous than mice and memories. The next morning was Saturday, Sarah's one day off. She woke to find Emma already dressed, sitting on the edge of her bed with her coat on, looking at Sarah with such hopeful expectation that it hurt. "All right," Sarah heard herself say, "we'll go look, but just from the outside, and we stay together." Emma's squeal of delight was so pure, so full of uncomplicated joy, that Sarah felt something crack in her chest. When had she become the kind of mother who made such a big deal out of letting her kid explore? When had fear become her default setting? They bundled up against the cold and headed across the frozen field. The ground was hard as concrete beneath their boots, the dead grass crunching with each step. Sarah kept one hand on Emma's shoulder, partly for guidance, partly for reassurance that she was still there. Up close, the Hobbit house was even stranger than it looked from a distance. The stones were enormous, fitted together without mortar in some places, the gaps filled with ancient cement in others. The wooden door was thick as a dictionary, bound with iron straps that had rusted to a deep orange. Above the door, carved into a stone lintel, were words so weathered Sarah could barely make them out. 1947. What we preserve, we honor. "What does that mean?" Emma asked, tracing the letters with her mittened finger. "I don't know, baby," Sarah admitted. Probably just something the builder thought sounded important. The door had no visible lock, just an iron ring for a handle. Sarah pulled on it experimentally, expecting nothing. To her surprise, the door shuddered, then shifted inward with a groan of old wood and older hinges. A breath of air rolled out, stale and cold but somehow dry, preserved. "Mama," Emma whispered, her eyes huge. It opened. Sarah's heart hammered. This was the moment she should turn around, take Emma home, call the sheriff, or the Historical Society, or someone official. But something stopped her. Maybe it was Emma's face, lit with wonder. Maybe it was her own curiosity, dormant for so long under layers of exhaustion and fear. Maybe it was just the desperate hope that there might be something in this world that wasn't exactly what it seemed. "Stay close to me," Sarah said, pulling out her phone and turning on the flashlight. "If I say we leave immediately. Understood?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise." They stepped inside together. The first thing Sarah noticed was the temperature. It was cold, but not as cold as outside. The air had a stillness to it, a quality of being undisturbed for a very long time. The phone's light cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls, a low ceiling, and a floor that had been swept clean. No debris, no animal droppings, no obvious signs of decay. They were in a small entrance chamber, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were lined with empty shelves. At the back of the room, another door stood slightly ajar. "This is weird," Sarah murmured, more to herself than Emma. "It's too clean, too organized." Emma had already moved to the second door, peering through the gap. "Mama, there's stairs." Sarah joined her, shining the light through. Sure enough, stone steps led downward into deeper darkness. They were wide steps, carefully cut, with a rope handrail bolted to the wall. Everything about this place suggested intention, care, preservation. "We should go back," Sarah said, but her feet didn't move. "This is probably private property. We could get in trouble." "Please," Emma whispered, "just a little further, just to see where it goes." Sarah thought about the bills on her kitchen table, The broken car, the landlord's threats, the endless grind of barely making it. What harm could it do to go a little further? To let Emma have this one small adventure? To pretend, just for a moment, that fairy tales might be real? "Okay," Sarah said, "but we're not going far, and we're being careful. Test each step before you put your weight on it." They descended slowly, Sarah going first now, testing each stone step. The stairs curved as they went down, spiraling gently. The rope handrail was old but solid, the bolts still firmly anchored. After maybe 20 steps, they reached a landing. And then Sarah's flashlight revealed something that made her stop breathing. A tunnel. Not a crude cave or a hand-dug cellar, but a proper tunnel with smooth stone walls, an arched ceiling, and a floor that had been paved with flat stones. It stretched ahead into darkness, maybe 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall. Every 10 feet or so, there were metal brackets on the walls that must have once held torches or lights. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered. Her voice echoed strangely, as if the tunnel went on for a long distance. Emma squeezed her hand. "It's like a secret passage, like in the stories." Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't just an old house. This was something else entirely. A bunker, a smuggling tunnel, a mine. But there was no mining in this area, never had been, and the craftsmanship was too deliberate, too careful for something illegal. They moved forward slowly, the phone's light barely pushing back the darkness. The air grew colder but remained dry. After maybe 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a chamber, and Sarah's flashlight beam scattered across something that reflected back, glass. She stepped into the chamber and swept the light around. Her breath caught. Display cases. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, lined the walls and stood in rows throughout the room. Each case was made of thick glass and dark wood, the kind you'd see in a museum. And inside each case was something different. Books, paintings, sculptures, artifacts she couldn't immediately identify. Everything was perfectly preserved, protected from air and light and time. "Mama," Emma breathed. "What is all this?" Sarah moved closer to the nearest case. Inside was a painting, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, in an ornate gold frame. Even in the dim light from her phone, she could see the quality of it, the way the colors seemed to glow. The signature in the corner meant nothing to her, but something about the style tickled her memory. She'd seen paintings like this before, in art history books from her 2 years of community college before everything fell apart. The next case held books, old leather-bound volumes with titles in languages she didn't recognize. Another contained what looked like ancient pottery, decorated with scenes of people and animals. A fourth held jewelry, necklaces and bracelets that glittered even in the weak light, gold and silver and stones she couldn't name. "Is this real?" Emma asked, moving from case to case with wide eyes. "Is it treasure?" Sarah's hands were shaking. She didn't know art. She didn't know antiques. But she knew enough to recognize that what she was looking at wasn't junk from someone's attic. This was serious. This was valuable. This was impossible. She pulled out her phone, her fingers clumsy on the screen. No signal. Of course, they were too far underground, too deep in the stone. "We need to go back," Sarah said, her voice unsteady. "Right now. We need to tell someone about this." But Emma had wandered to the far end of the chamber, where another tunnel entrance yawned dark. "Mama, there's more. It keeps going." Sarah grabbed her daughter's hand, maybe too tightly. "Emma, no, we're leaving. This is too much. This is something we shouldn't be messing with." "But what if there's more treasure? What if we could—" "Emma!" Sarah's voice was sharp with fear. "We're leaving. Now." They made their way back through the tunnel, up the stone steps, through the entrance chamber, and out into the winter daylight. Sarah pulled the heavy door closed behind them, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. They stood in the frozen field, breath pluming white, staring at each other. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "what was that?" "I don't know, baby," Sarah admitted. "But it's something important, something someone hid away a long time ago." "Are we going to tell people?" Sarah thought about the bills on her table. The landlord who wanted more money. The car that needed fixing. She thought about the stories the town told about this place, about curses and disappearances. She thought about what might happen if word got out about what they'd found. And then she thought about the date carved above the door, 1947, right after World War II. Right when a lot of things in Europe had been lost, stolen, hidden, or destroyed. "Yeah," Sarah said slowly. "We're going to tell people. But first, I need to do some research. I need to understand what we found before we report it." They walked back across the frozen field in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Sarah's mind was racing, tumbling over itself with questions and possibilities and fears she couldn't quite name. When they reached the duplex, Sarah made hot chocolate, the real kind from the emergency tin she kept hidden in the back of the cupboard for special occasions. They sat together on the worn couch, hands wrapped around warm mugs, and Emma leaned against her mother's side. "Mama," Emma said after a long silence, "in the stories, when people find treasure, it always belongs to someone else. Someone who lost it a long time ago." Sarah looked down at her daughter, surprised by the insight. "That's true? What made you think of that?" Emma shrugged, her small shoulders moving under her oversized sweater. "The way everything was in those cases. It looked like someone was keeping them safe, like they were waiting to give them back." Sarah's throat tightened, 9 years old and already wiser than most adults she knew. "You're right, baby. I think that's exactly what was happening. So we have to find out who they belong to." "We have to try," Sarah said. "Even if it's hard, even if it takes a long time, because keeping something that doesn't belong to you, that's stealing, and we're not thieves." Emma nodded seriously, then took a sip of her hot chocolate. "Miss Henderson at school says finders keepers is a rule." Sarah smiled despite everything. "Miss Henderson teaches 2nd grade, not law, and I think this is more complicated than playground rules." They sat there for a while longer, watching the snow begin to fall outside, each flake drifting down like a small frozen secret. Sarah thought about the vault beneath the Hobbit house, about all those artifacts waiting in the darkness. She thought about the hands that had placed them there, carefully, reverently. She thought about the families who might have been searching for them for decades. Later that afternoon, Sarah called her boss at the auto shop and asked if she could come in for a few hours. She needed the overtime, but more than that, she needed to think, to process what she'd seen. Miller's auto repair was quiet on Saturdays, just her and old man Miller himself, who spent most of his time in the office doing paperwork. She changed the oil on a pickup truck, rotated tires on a sedan, replaced brake pads on a minivan. The familiar work calmed her, the routine of it, the predictability. Under a hood, problems had solutions. Parts broke and you replaced them. Fluids leaked and you topped them off. Everything made sense. But her mind kept drifting back to the vault, to the paintings and the pottery and the jewelry, to the careful preservation of it all, to the date carved in stone, 1947. When Miller shuffled out of his office around 4, he found Sarah sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at nothing, a wrench loose in her oil-stained hand. "You all right, Sarah?" he asked, his voice gruff with decades of cigarette smoke. She looked up, startled. "Yeah, sorry, just thinking." He studied her for a moment. Miller was in his 70s, had run this shop since 1968. He knew cars and he knew people, and he had a way of seeing things others missed. "That's a heavy thinking face," he said, "more than bills and brake pads." Sarah hesitated. She should keep quiet. She should wait until she knew more, understood more. But something about Miller's weathered face, about the way he'd given her this job when no one else would, made her want to tell someone. "If you found something valuable," she said slowly, "something that didn't belong to you, what would you do?" Miller scratched his chin. "Depends. What kind of valuable?" "Really valuable, like life-changing valuable, but also something that probably belongs to someone else, someone who's been looking for it for a long time." Miller was quiet for a moment, then he pulled up another bucket and sat down, his knees creaking. "You find something out at that old Kellerman place?" Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I've seen your little girl standing at that fence," Miller said. "And I know that look you've got. That's not a woman wondering about hypotheticals. That's a woman who's seen something real." Sarah swallowed hard. "If I tell you, you can't tell anyone else. Not yet. I need to figure out what to do." "All right," Miller said simply. So Sarah told him about Emma's curiosity, about the unlocked door in the tunnel, about the vault filled with art and artifacts, all carefully preserved, all waiting in the darkness for over 70 years. When she finished, Miller let out a low whistle. "Well, damn." "I don't know what to do," Sarah admitted. "Part of me wants to just lock that door and pretend we never saw it. But that's not right. Those things, they probably belong to families, to museums, to history." "But," Miller prompted. Sarah looked down at her hands. "But I'm scared. Of what happens when I report it. Of who might come looking. Of whether anyone will even believe me." Miller nodded slowly. "You know what I remember about old Leopold Kellerman. I was just a kid when he died, but my daddy worked on his car a few times. Said he was the most careful man he'd ever met, measured everything twice, asked questions about every repair, like he was protecting something precious." "What happened to him?" "Heart attack, they said. Dropped dead in 1952. No family anyone knew of. The state tried to settle his estate, but it got tangled up in legal issues. Something about unclear ownership, questions about where his money came from. Eventually, they just sealed the property and forgot about it." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Why would the state forget about a property? Miller shrugged. This was 1952, remember? Cold War, McCarthyism. Kellerman was foreign, secretive, had money from somewhere. People whispered he might be a spy, a communist, worse. Maybe the government decided it was easier to just lock it up and move on. "And now we opened it," Sarah said quietly. "Now you opened it," Miller corrected. "And you get to decide what happens next." That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open. She started searching. Art collections, World War II, Montana, hidden treasures, 1947. The results were overwhelming and mostly useless. Conspiracy theories and treasure-hunting forums and historical societies. But then she found something. A newspaper article from 1948, archived in the Montana Historical Society database. The headline read, "Eccentric millionaire builds mysterious estate in Frost Ridge." Sarah leaned forward, reading hungrily. The article described a man named Leopold Kellerman, Austrian by birth, who had emigrated to America in 1938, just before the war. He'd made his fortune in banking and had apparently spent the last years of his life building an unusual home in Montana, far from any major city. Neighbors described him as secretive and odd, someone who kept to himself and received mysterious deliveries at all hours. He'd died in 1952. The article said his estate had been tied up in legal disputes for years, something about unclear ownership and questions about whether he'd had any heirs. Eventually, the property had been abandoned, sealed up, forgotten. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. An Austrian banker who left Europe right before World War II, a man who built a secret underground vault in Montana, a collection of art and artifacts hidden away for over 70 years. She thought about all the stories she'd heard about Nazi looting, about Jewish families whose priceless collections had been stolen, about treasures that disappeared during the war and were never recovered, about the desperate efforts to preserve culture in the face of destruction. What we preserve, we honor. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered to her empty kitchen. She spent the next 3 hours researching, following link after link, reading about art restitution, about wartime preservation efforts, about the complex web of theft, rescue and hiding that had characterized the war years. Some art had been stolen by the Nazis, but some had been hidden by families desperate to save their heritage. Some had been rescued by brave individuals who risked everything to preserve culture. By the time Sarah finally closed her laptop, The sky outside was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. She hadn't slept. Her eyes burned. Her coffee had gone cold 3 times. But she understood now, or thought she did. Leopold Kellerman hadn't been a thief. He'd been a preserver, someone who had managed to rescue art and artifacts from the destruction of war and had hidden them away, waiting for a time when they could be returned safely. Except he'd died before he could do that, and his secret had died with him, until a curious 9-year-old girl and her exhausted mother had stumbled upon it. Sarah knew what she had to do, what she should have done immediately. She needed to report this to the authorities, to art historians, to someone who could properly document and identify everything in that vault. The artifacts probably belonged to families who had spent decades searching for them. They belonged to museums, to cultures, to history. But the thought of giving up that secret, of letting others take over, filled her with an unexpected reluctance. For the first time in years, she'd touched something extraordinary. She'd been part of something bigger than oil changes and past due notices. She thought about Emma's face in the vault, lit with wonder. She thought about the fairy tales her daughter loved, about brave people who found treasures and lived happily ever after. Real life didn't work that way. Sarah knew that. The treasure wasn't hers. The happy ending wasn't guaranteed. But maybe, just maybe, she could be part of something good, something that mattered. When Emma woke up that morning, she found her mother already dressed, making pancakes, the first real breakfast they'd had in weeks. "Are we going back?" Emma asked hopefully. "Not today," Sarah said, flipping a pancake. "Today I need to make some phone calls, important ones, because what we found, baby, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the world, and we're going to make sure it gets back where it belongs." Emma looked disappointed for a moment, then thoughtful. Like in the stories, where the heroes return the magic items to their rightful owners. Sarah smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Yeah, exactly like that. She didn't know yet that making those calls would change everything. That within days, their small town would be swarmed with experts and reporters and people asking questions. That powerful interests would emerge, claiming ownership, threatening lawsuits, making accusations. That some of the most dangerous people in the world would learn about the vault and would stop at nothing to control it. She didn't know that the laughing would start soon. People saying she was crazy, seeing things, making up stories for attention. That she'd need every ounce of courage she had just to stand her ground. All she knew was that she and Emma had found something extraordinary hidden beneath the frozen earth. And for the first time in years, Sarah Hartley felt like she was part of something bigger than survival. She finished making breakfast, sat down with her daughter, and together they ate pancakes and planned what they would say when the world came calling. The frozen Hobbit house held its secrets a little longer, but not for much longer. Sarah made her first call on Monday morning, right after dropping Emma at school. She sat in her car in the parking lot, hands shaking as she dialed the number for the Montana Historical Society. The woman who answered sounded bored until Sarah mentioned Leopold Kellerman's name. "I'm sorry, did you say Kellerman?" the woman asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "Leopold Kellerman from Frost Ridge." "Yes," Sarah said. "I found something, at his old property. I think it's important." There was a pause. "What kind of something?" Sarah took a deep breath. "A vault, underground, filled with art and artifacts. Hundreds of pieces, maybe thousands, all preserved, all hidden since the 1940s. The silence on the other end lasted so long Sarah thought the call had dropped. Then the woman said, her voice careful and measured, "Ma'am, I'm going to transfer you to our director. Please hold." 2 hours later, Sarah was back at the Hobbit house, this time with 3 people from the Historical Society. Director Margaret Chen was a small woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an air of barely contained excitement. She'd brought 2 assistants, both young men with cameras and clipboards who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Sarah led them inside, down the stone steps, through the tunnel. With each step, she watched Margaret's expression shift from professional skepticism to wonder. When they reached the first chamber, Margaret stopped breathing for a full 10 seconds. Then she moved forward like a woman in a dream, her hands hovering over the glass cases, not quite touching. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, it's real." One of the assistants, a kid named Trevor, started taking photographs. The camera flash bounced off the glass cases, illuminating paintings and sculptures in brief, brilliant bursts. The other assistant, Marcus, was writing frantically on his clipboard, trying to catalogue what he was seeing. Margaret had stopped in front of a painting, a portrait of a young woman in 18th century dress. Even in the dim light, the quality was obvious. The brushwork, the colours, the way the woman's eyes seemed to follow you. "This is a Vigée Lebrun," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "A real one. I've only ever seen reproductions." She turned to Sarah. "Do you understand what you've found?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really. I know it's valuable. I know it's old. But I don't know art." Margaret laughed, a sound caught between joy and disbelief. "Valuable doesn't begin to cover it. If even half of what I'm seeing is authentic, this is one of the most significant art discoveries in decades." They spent 4 hours in the vault that day. Margaret examined every case they could reach, taking notes, making preliminary identifications: 18th century French paintings, Renaissance sculptures, ancient Greek pottery, medieval illuminated manuscripts, jewelry from a dozen different cultures and time periods, and that was just the first chamber. "There are more rooms," Sarah said quietly. "The tunnel keeps going. We didn't explore that far." Margaret looked at her, eyes wide. "Show me." They went deeper into the tunnel system, following corridors that branched and twisted like veins through stone. They found 6 more chambers, each one filled with display cases, each case holding treasures that made Margaret gasp or mutter in disbelief. In the 3rd chamber, they found a case containing nothing but photographs. Old black and white images of families, of homes, of children playing. Each photograph had a small tag attached with careful handwriting identifying names and dates and places. "These are the owners," Margaret said, her voice soft. "The families these pieces belong to." He documented everything. The 4th chamber held books, not just a few dozen, but hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Leather-bound volumes in German, French, Italian, Hebrew, Russian, first editions, rare manuscripts, things that shouldn't exist anymore, that should have been lost to fire, or theft, or time. The 5th chamber was dedicated to religious artifacts: Jewish menorahs and Torah scrolls, Christian reliquaries and illuminated gospels, Islamic calligraphy and ancient Korans, all preserved with equal reverence, equal care. Margaret stood in the center of that room and wept. Trevor and Marcus exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure what to do. Sarah just waited, understanding somehow that this was bigger than any of them had imagined. By the time they emerged back into daylight, it was late afternoon. The winter sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the frozen field in shades of orange and gold. Margaret sat in her car for 10 minutes, just staring at nothing, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Finally, she turned to Sarah. "This is going to explode. You understand that? Once word gets out, this will be international news. Every government, every museum, every family that lost something during the war is going to be calling." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know. Are you ready for that?" Sarah thought about Emma, about their small duplex, about the quiet life they'd built from the wreckage of the divorce. She thought about bills and brake pads and the simple survival that had defined her existence for years. "No," she admitted, "but I don't think I have a choice." Margaret reached out and squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing, calling us, not trying to sell any of it. Leopold Kellerman would have been proud." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma's soft breathing from the next room. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Margaret, from other people at the Historical Society, from a lawyer they'd assigned to help her navigate what was coming. The next morning, the first reporter showed up. Sarah had just gotten back from dropping Emma at school when she found a van parked outside the duplex. A woman with perfectly styled hair and 2 white teeth was standing on the cracked sidewalk, a cameraman beside her. "Sarah Hartley," the woman asked, smiling like they were old friends. I'm Jessica Winters from Channel 7 News. I understand you've made quite a discovery. Sarah's stomach dropped. How did you find out? We have sources. So it's true? You found Nazi treasure in an old house? It's not Nazi treasure, Sarah said sharply. It's art and artifacts that were rescued during World War II. There's a difference. But Jessica's eyes had already glazed over, no longer listening, already crafting her headline. So you're saying it is treasure from the war, hidden by Nazis? No, that's not what I said. Please leave. This is private property. Jessica's smile didn't waver. The public has a right to know, Miss Hartley. This is a story of national significance. Don't you think people deserve to hear about it? Sarah went inside and locked the door. Through the window, she watched Jessica do a stand-up report on her lawn, gesturing dramatically at the duplex, at the distant Hobbit house, painting a picture of mystery and intrigue that had nothing to do with the truth. By noon, there were 4 more news vans. By evening, the story had hit social media. By the next morning, it had gone viral. The headlines were everything Sarah had feared, and worse. Single mum discovers Nazi gold in Montana. Hidden Holocaust treasure found in Hobbit house. Struggling mechanic strikes it rich with war loot. Every version got the story wrong. Every article focused on the wrong things, on dollar values and dramatic reveals, on Nazi intrigue and hidden gold. Nobody talked about Leopold Kellerman's careful preservation. Nobody mentioned the photographs of families, the meticulous documentation, the reverence with which everything had been stored. And nobody believed Sarah when she tried to correct them. At Miller's Auto Repair, her co-workers started treating her differently. Some with awe, some with suspicion, all with a distance that hurt more than mockery. When she tried to explain what she'd actually found, they nodded politely and changed the subject. At Emma's school, parents whispered in the parking lot. Some pulled their children away when Emma approached. One mother cornered Sarah at pickup and demanded to know if she was going to share the treasure with the town since they'd been living among them under false pretenses. What false pretenses? Sarah asked, bewildered. I'm a mechanic. I work at Miller's. I've never pretended to be anything else. But the woman just sniffed and walked away, taking her daughter's hand and throwing one last suspicious glance over her shoulder. The worst came 3 days later, at the diner where Sarah sometimes took Emma for breakfast on Saturdays when they had a little extra money. They walked in to find the usual morning crowd, farmers and retirees and families with sleepy-eyed kids. The chatter stopped the moment Sarah and Emma entered. Martha, the owner who'd always saved them the good booth by the window, avoided Sarah's eyes as she showed them to a table in the back corner, near the kitchen where it was hot and loud. They ordered pancakes, Emma's favorite. While they waited, Sarah heard the whispers from nearby tables. That's her, the one who found it. I heard it's worth billions. Actual billions. And she's still living in that ratty duplex? Something's not right. My cousin said she's probably working with some international crime syndicate. I heard she's already sold half of it on the black market. Emma looked up at her mother, confusion and hurt written across her small face. Mama, why are they talking about us like that? Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. Because people don't understand, baby. They're scared of what they don't know, so they make up stories. But Emma's eyes were filling with tears. Are we bad people now? No, Sarah said fiercely. We're not bad people. We found something important and we did the right thing. That makes us good people, even if nobody else can see it yet. Their pancakes arrived cold. Martha slapped the plates down without her usual warm smile and hurried away before Sarah could say thank you. They ate in silence, the food tasting like ash, while the whispers continued around them. That afternoon, Sarah got a call from Emma's teacher, Miss Henderson. I'm concerned about Emma, she said carefully. Some of the other children have been asking her questions about the treasure, about whether she's rich now. It's creating a distraction in the classroom. Emma hasn't done anything wrong, Sarah said, her grip tightening on the phone. She's just trying to go to school like normal. I understand that. but perhaps it would be better if Emma stayed home for a few days, just until things settled down. Sarah wanted to argue, to fight back, to demand that Emma be treated fairly. But she heard the exhaustion in Miss Henderson's voice and understood. The teacher wasn't being cruel. She was just overwhelmed, caught in the middle of something she didn't know how to handle. "Fine," Sarah said quietly. "I'll keep her home." She hung up and stood in her tiny kitchen, surrounded by bills and news clippings and the wreckage of her suddenly complicated life, and for the first time since finding the vault, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But then Emma came out of her room, dragging her backpack, looking small and lost. "Mama, Miss Henderson called, didn't she? I don't have to go back to school." Sarah knelt down and pulled her daughter into a hug. "Just for a few days, baby. Just until people calm down." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said in a small voice, "I wish we'd never found the treasure." Sarah's heart broke. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch watching cartoons, Sarah returned to the Hobbit house alone. She needed to see it again, to remember why this mattered, to find some thread of purpose in the chaos her life had become. She descended into the tunnel with only her phone's flashlight, the darkness closing around her like a familiar embrace. In the first chamber, she stood among the display cases and tried to see them the way Margaret had seen them, with wonder and reverence. But all she could think about was Emma's face at the diner, the whispers, the accusations, the way her daughter had said, "I wish we'd never found the treasure." Sarah moved deeper into the tunnel system, past chambers she'd explored with Margaret, into corridors they hadn't reached yet. The tunnel branched and twisted, leading her through the stone darkness like a maze. She found another chamber, smaller than the others, that contained nothing but filing cabinets. She opened the first drawer carefully. Inside were folders, hundreds of them, each one labeled with a name and a date. She pulled one out at random. Rothstein Family, Vienna, 1938. 7 paintings, 3 sculptures, assorted jewelry. Status, preserved. Location, Chamber 3, cases 12 through 18. To be returned when safe. Sarah opened another folder. Cohen Family, Berlin, 1939. Manuscript collection, ritual objects. Status, preserved. Location, Chamber 5, cases 6 through 9. To be returned when safe. She stood there for a long time, pulling folder after folder, reading the careful documentation. Leopold Kellerman hadn't stolen these things. He'd rescued them. Families fleeing the Nazi regime had entrusted him with their most precious possessions, believing he could keep them safe until the war ended and they could reclaim them. Except most of them never came back, never survived to reclaim anything. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. This wasn't treasure. This was grief, preserved in glass and stone. This was loss, documented and catalogued and waiting for descendants who might not even know these things existed. She heard footsteps behind her and spun around, heart hammering. A figure stood in the chamber entrance, backlit by a flashlight that made it impossible to see their face. "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, her voice shakier than she wanted. The figure stepped forward, and Sarah recognized Margaret Chen. The older woman looked exhausted, her usually neat hair disheveled, dark circles under her eyes. "I thought I might find you here," Margaret said softly. "I saw your car outside." "How did you get in?" "You left the door unlocked." Margaret moved closer, her own flashlight beam joining Sarah's to illuminate the filing cabinets. "What have you found?" "Records," Sarah said. "Documentation for everything in the vault. Kellerman kept track of it all. Who it belonged to, where it came from, why he was keeping it." Margaret opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and read silently. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. He was trying to save it, to preserve it until the families could reclaim it. "But they never did," Sarah said. "Most of them died in the camps, or fled and never came back, and Kellerman died before he could return any of it." They stood together in the small chamber, surrounded by the ghosts of families long dead, by the careful records of a man who'd tried to do right and had run out of time. "Sarah," Margaret said finally. I need to tell you something. The value of this collection, it's not millions. It's not even tens of millions. Sarah waited, her stomach tight with dread. Our preliminary estimates put it at around $275 million, and that's conservative. Some of these pieces are literally priceless. They're the only surviving examples of lost works. They're culturally significant beyond any monetary value. Sarah sat down hard on the stone floor. $275 million. The number was so big it didn't feel real, didn't feel like it belonged to the same world as her duplex rent and her car's broken brake pads. But it's not mine, she said quietly. None of it is mine. No, Margaret agreed. It belongs to the descendants of the families who entrusted it to Kellerman. It belongs to museums and cultural institutions. It belongs to history. Then why does everyone in town think I'm suddenly rich? Why are people treating me like I stole something? Margaret sat down beside her, their backs against the cold stone wall. Because people are scared of things they don't understand. And because greed makes people irrational. They see dollar signs, and they forget about everything else, about history and heritage, and the fact that these objects represent real families who suffered real losses. What happens next will turn this quiet town upside down, reveal truths that powerful people wanted buried forever, and test whether one mother's courage is enough to stand against forces that have kept secrets for 70 years. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. There's something else you need to know, Margaret continued. We've started reaching out to descendants of the families documented in these files, and we've had some concerning responses. Concerning how? Some people are claiming ownership who can't prove any connection to the families. Others are threatening lawsuits, and there's a group they call themselves the Heritage Recovery Foundation. They're claiming that Kellerman actually stole these pieces, that he was working with the Nazis, and that everything in this vault should be seized and sold with the proceeds going to Holocaust survivors. Sarah's blood ran cold. But that's not true. These records prove he was trying to save it all. You and I know that, but they're well-funded and well-connected. They've already filed preliminary claims with the state, and they have lawyers, Sarah. Expensive ones. I can't fight lawyers. I can barely afford my rent. Margaret turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the flashlights, her expression was fierce. You won't have to fight alone. The Historical Society is behind you, and I've been in contact with the Holocaust Museum in Washington. They're sending experts to help authenticate and document everything. We're going to do this right. But Sarah barely heard her. All she could think about was Emma's face at the diner. The whispers, the accusations, and now lawyers, lawsuits, people who wanted to take this away, to twist the truth, to turn Leopold Kellerman's act of preservation into something ugly. I should never have opened that door, she whispered. No, Margaret said firmly. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, what Kellerman was waiting for someone to do. You gave these families their history back. You gave their stories a chance to be heard. That matters more than you know. Over the next week, things got worse before they got better. The Heritage Recovery Foundation held a press conference in Helena, Montana's capital. Their spokesman, a slick man in an expensive suit named Richard Vandenberg, stood in front of cameras and painted Leopold Kellerman as a Nazi collaborator who'd stolen Jewish property and hidden it in Montana. He had documents, he claimed. Evidence that Kellerman had been under investigation by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, in 1946. That he'd fled to America with stolen property and had built his vault to hide his crimes. The media ate it up. Every news outlet ran the story. The narrative shifted overnight from heroic discovery to stolen Nazi gold to single mother involved in international art theft conspiracy. Sarah's landlord gave her 30 days' notice. Miller told her to take a leave of absence from the auto shop until things settled down. Parents at Emma's school demanded she be expelled, claiming her presence was dangerous and disruptive. One night, someone threw a brick through the window of the duplex. Attached was a note. Thieves get what they deserve. Sarah swept up the glass with shaking hands while Emma hid in her bedroom, crying. They spent that night at a cheap motel on the edge of town, the door double-locked, Sarah lying awake, listening for sounds of danger. But then something shifted. It started with a phone call from an elderly woman in New York named Ruth Goldberg. She'd seen the news coverage and had recognized one of the items shown in a photograph, a silver menorah that had belonged to her grandmother's family in Vienna. "My grandmother used to tell me about that menorah," Ruth said, her voice trembling over the phone. She described it in such detail, every scroll and leaf. She said it was the last thing she saw when the Nazis took everything. She never thought she'd see it again. She died, believing it was lost forever. Ruth flew to Montana on her own dime. Margaret arranged for her to visit the vault. Sarah was there when Ruth descended into the tunnel, when she stood in front of the case containing the menorah, when she pressed her hand against the glass and wept. "My grandmother would have given anything to know it survived," Ruth said. "That someone cared enough to keep it safe. That it wasn't destroyed or melted down. Just knowing it exists, that's everything." The news crews caught Ruth leaving the vault, tears streaming down her face. They captured her saying, "This isn't stolen property. This is my family's heritage, preserved by a brave man who risked everything. And that woman, Sarah Hartley, she gave it back to us. She's a hero." More families came forward, descendants of the names in Kellerman's files. They brought photographs, documents, stories passed down through generations. Each one authenticated another piece of the collection. Each one proved that Kellerman hadn't been a thief but a guardian. A historian from the Holocaust Museum spent 2 weeks in the vault, cross-referencing Kellerman's records with historical documents. He held a press conference when he finished, his evidence ironclad and his conclusions clear. Leopold Kellerman was a member of an underground network that helped Jewish families escape Nazi-occupied Europe, he announced. He arranged for their most precious cultural items to be smuggled out and hidden until it was safe to return them. He documented everything meticulously, and he died before he could complete his mission. What Sarah Hartley found isn't stolen property. It's one of the most significant rescue efforts of the 20th century. The Heritage Recovery Foundation's claims crumbled under scrutiny. Their documents turned out to be fabricated, their evidence falsified. Richard Vandenberg disappeared before he could be charged with fraud, but his organization dissolved in scandal. The town of Frost Ridge, which had whispered and accused and thrown bricks, began to change its tune. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Martha at the diner apologized with tears in her eyes and free pancakes for a month. Emma's school sent a formal letter of apology and invited Sarah to speak to the students about history and courage. Miller showed up at the duplex one evening with a check. "From everyone at the shop," he said gruffly, "to help with your expenses, to say we're sorry we didn't believe you." Sarah tried to refuse it, but Miller pressed it into her hands. "Take it. You stood your ground when the whole town turned on you. That takes guts. That deserves respect." But the most important change came on a cold February morning when a bus pulled up outside the Hobbit house. It carried 23 people, descendants of 7 different families whose property Kellerman had preserved. They'd come from Israel, from New York, from California, from England. They'd come to see what their grandparents and great-grandparents had left behind. Sarah met them at the entrance, nervous and uncertain. She'd never felt more like a fraud, like someone who'd stumbled into a story too big for her to carry. But an old man stepped forward, leaning heavily on a cane, his eyes bright despite his age. "You are Sarah?" he asked, his accent thick, but his English clear. "You are the one who found this place?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm Sarah. This is my daughter Emma. She's the one who wanted to explore it." The old man looked at Emma and smiled. "Then you, little one, you have given me a gift I never thought to receive. My grandfather, he was a jeweler in Prague. The Nazis took his shop, his home, everything. But he gave his most precious things to a man he trusted, a banker named Kellerman. He made my grandmother promise that someday, when it was safe, she would find that man and reclaim our family's history." He pulled a photograph from his pocket, creased and faded, showing a young couple standing in front of a jewelry shop. My grandparents. They died in Auschwitz, but their treasures they survived, because of Kellerman. And now, because of you, I can finally keep my grandmother's promise. Sarah found herself crying, Emma's hand tight in hers. Around them, other descendants were nodding, their eyes wet, their faces filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite name. Not quite joy, not quite grief, but something in between, something like closure, something like peace. They spent the day in the vault, these families who had lost so much. They stood in front of cases containing paintings their ancestors had commissioned, books their relatives had written, jewelry that had been worn at weddings and bar mitzvahs and celebrations long ago. They took photographs, they told stories, they wept and laughed and held each other. And through it all, Sarah understood something she hadn't grasped before. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about connection, about the threads that tie us to our past, to our families, to our heritage. It was about the desperate human need to be remembered, to have our stories survive even when we don't. That evening, after the families had left and the vault was quiet again, Sarah sat on the stone steps at the entrance with Emma beside her. The winter sun was setting, painting the frozen field in shades of pink and gold. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "do you think those people are happy now?" Sarah thought about the old man with his grandmother's photograph, about Ruth Goldberg weeping in front of her family's menorah, about all the descendants who'd spent their lives knowing something precious had been lost and now had found it again. "I think they're healing," Sarah said. "I think they've been carrying a wound for a long time, and now it can finally start to close." Emma nodded, then leaned against her mother's side. "I'm glad I wanted to explore. I'm glad you said yes." Sarah wrapped her arm around her daughter and pulled her close. "Me too, baby. Me too." The cease and desist letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed Sarah the thick envelope. She signed for it standing in her doorway, still in her work coveralls from the early shift at Miller's, grease under her fingernails and exhaustion in her bones. Inside were 23 pages of legal language Sarah barely understood. But the message was clear enough. The Heritage Recovery Foundation claimed ownership of the entire Kellerman vault based on international law regarding stolen property. They were demanding immediate access to the site and threatening criminal charges if Sarah interfered. She called Margaret Chen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. "They can't do this," Margaret said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "You're the legal owner of the property. You haven't claimed ownership of the collection. You've been cooperating with authorities. Then why are they threatening me with jail?" Margaret was silent for a moment. "Because they're trying to scare you, intimidate you into giving up. Sarah, you need a lawyer, a good one." "I can't afford a lawyer," Sarah said, looking around her tiny duplex at the bills stacked on the kitchen table, at Emma's worn shoes by the door that needed replacing. "I can barely afford groceries." "I'll make some calls," Margaret promised. "We'll find someone." But that was just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Sarah was served with 4 more legal documents. A group calling itself the Kellerman Family Trust claimed they were distant relatives with rights to the estate. A European museum filed papers asserting that certain items in the vault had been stolen from their collection during the war. An auction house in New York sent a letter offering to sell the entire collection and split the proceeds, conveniently taking a 40% commission. Each letter, each legal filing, each threat felt like a weight added to Sarah's shoulders. She stopped sleeping. She couldn't eat. Emma found her crying in the bathroom one night and wrapped her small arms around her mother's waist, neither of them saying anything because there was nothing to say. At Miller's Auto Repair, the other mechanics had started avoiding her again, but this time it wasn't because they thought she was rich. It was because they thought she was cursed. Word had spread about the lawsuits, the threats, the way Sarah's life was unraveling. "Maybe you should just walk away," Miller said one afternoon, finding Sarah alone in the bay, staring at an engine she was supposed to be rebuilding. "Give them what they want and go back to normal." "I can't," Sarah said quietly. Those families, the ones who are coming forward with proof, with documentation. If I walk away, if I let these people take control, those families lose everything. Again. Miller scratched his jaw, uncomfortable. That's not your responsibility, Sarah. You're just one person. You can't take on the whole world. But Sarah thought about Ruth Goldberg crying in front of her grandmother's menorah, about the old man from Prague with his faded photograph, about all the stories that had been lost and were now being found. Maybe not, she admitted, but I have to try. The lawyer Margaret found was named David Chen, no relation despite the shared last name. He was young, maybe 35, with an intensity that reminded Sarah of someone who'd been underestimated his whole life and had learned to fight back. He specialized in property law and had taken on several high-profile art restitution cases. He met Sarah at a coffee shop in Helena, 2 hours from Frost Ridge, because Sarah was afraid to be seen with a lawyer in her own town. The whispers had started again, meaner this time. People saying she was greedy, that she was fighting legitimate claims just to get famous, that she was no better than the thieves she claimed to be exposing. David spread the legal documents across the coffee shop table, his eyes scanning them with practiced efficiency. Most of these are garbage, he said bluntly. Frivolous claims designed to muddy the waters. The Kellerman Family Trust is particularly laughable. I did some research. The lawyer who filed it has a history of fraudulent claims. He files dozens of these, hoping someone will settle just to avoid the hassle. What about the Heritage Recovery Foundation? Sarah asked. They seem more serious. David's expression darkened. They are serious and dangerous. The foundation is fronted by Richard Vandenberg, but the real money behind it comes from a consortium of private collectors, people who see this vault as the buying opportunity of the century. If they can seize it under the guise of Holocaust restitution, they can liquidate everything and pocket the difference. Sarah felt sick. But that's exactly what they're claiming to be fighting against. That's theft. Welcome to the art world, David said dryly, where principle is flexible and profit is forever. He pulled out another document, this one with official government seals. This is the one that worries me most. The State Department has opened an inquiry. They're questioning whether Kellerman had legal authority to hold these items, whether you, as the property owner, are now in possession of stolen goods. But I'm not keeping them. I'm trying to return them to the rightful owners. I know that. You know that. But the State Department is under pressure from multiple foreign governments, all of whom have their own claims and agendas. This is about to become international, Sarah. And when that happens, you become very small and very vulnerable. Sarah's coffee had gone cold. She wrapped her hands around the cup anyway, needing something to hold on to. What do I do? We fight, David said simply. We document everything. We prove Kellerman's intent. We work with the Holocaust Museum and the Historical Society to authenticate every piece and trace its provenance. We find the families and we give them their voice, and we don't back down. Even if I lose everything? David looked at her for a long moment. You've already lost everything once, when your marriage ended, when you moved here with nothing. You rebuilt then. You'll rebuild again if you have to. But Sarah, if you walk away now, you'll lose something worse than money or property. You'll lose the knowledge that you did the right thing when it mattered most. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the old duplex creak and settle, thinking about David's words. She thought about the vault beneath the frozen earth, about all those treasures waiting in the darkness. She thought about Leopold Kellerman, dead for over 70 years, who'd trusted that someday someone would finish what he'd started. She thought about Emma, asleep in the next room, and wondered what kind of mother she was to drag her daughter into this mess, to choose a fight that wasn't theirs, to risk what little stability they'd built. But then she remembered Emma's words in the vault when they'd first discovered it. What if there's treasure? What if it's like in the stories, where the brave people find something amazing that helps them? Maybe the treasure wasn't the art. Maybe it was the chance to be brave. to teach Emma that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible. The next day brought a new development that changed everything. A historian from Vienna arrived in Frost Ridge, a small woman in her 70s named Dr. Ilse Hoffmann. She'd spent 40 years researching the underground networks that had helped families escape Nazi Europe, and she'd heard about the Kellerman Vault. Margaret brought her to Sarah's duplex, and the three women sat crowded around the tiny kitchen table while Dr. Hoffmann spread out her research. Photographs, documents, letters, all carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Leopold Kellerman was not just a banker, Dr. Hoffmann said, her accent thick but her English precise. He was part of a network we called the Preservation Society, a secret group of bankers, art dealers, and museum curators who worked together to rescue cultural treasures from Nazi theft. She pulled out a photograph of a group of men standing in front of a bank, dated 1937. She pointed to a tall man in the back row. "This is Kellerman, and this man beside him, this is my grandfather, Otto Hoffmann. They were friends. They worked together." Sarah leaned forward, studying the photograph. Kellerman looked serious, dignified, with sad eyes that seemed to see something the camera couldn't capture. "My grandfather kept journals," Dr. Hoffmann continued, pulling out a leather-bound book. "He wrote about the network's operations, how they would arrange for families to sell their property to trusted members, creating false paper trails to protect the real owners. How they smuggled items out of Europe through diplomatic channels. How they built secret repositories in neutral countries and in America, places where treasures could be hidden until the war ended." She opened the journal to a marked page. Here, June 1938. Otto writes about Kellerman. "Leopold has committed to building a repository in America. He has purchased land in Montana, far from the cities, where he can construct something permanent. He jokes that he is building a museum for ghosts, for all the families who may never return to claim what is theirs. But I know he believes they will return. He must believe it, or the work would be unbearable." Margaret was taking notes frantically. Sarah just sat frozen, staring at the journal's faded handwriting. "There's more," Dr. Hoffmann said. She pulled out official documents, stamped and signed. Kellerman's work was known to the American government. He was investigated by the OSS in 1946, yes, but not because they suspected him of theft. They investigated him because they wanted to recruit him, to use his knowledge of where treasures were hidden. He refused. He said his duty was to the families, not to governments. "Why didn't he return any of it?" Sarah asked. "If he had all this documentation, all this proof, why didn't he contact the families after the war?" Dr. Hoffmann's expression grew sad. "Because most of the families were dead. The names in his files, I have researched many of them. 90% perished in the camps. Those who survived were scattered, traumatized, often without documents or proof of ownership. And Kellerman himself, he was dying. Heart disease. He knew he had little time. I believe he was trying to organize everything, to create a system for returning items to heirs, when his heart failed in 1952. "So he died still protecting it all," Margaret said softly. "Yes. And the American government, they sealed the property because they did not know what to do with it. It was easier to forget, to let time bury the questions." Dr. Hoffmann looked at Sarah. "Until you opened the door, until you gave these families their history back." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "But now everyone wants to take it away. They're suing me. They're threatening me. They're saying I'm a thief." "Then we prove them wrong," Dr. Hoffmann said firmly. "I have documentation. I have my grandfather's journals. I have records from the Preservation Society. We show the world who Leopold Kellerman really was. We show them what you have discovered." Over the next week, Dr. Hoffmann worked with Margaret and David to build their case. They compiled evidence, cross-referenced documents, traced the provenance of every item in the vault back to its original owner. They contacted archives in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Prague. They found survivors and descendants scattered across the globe, but the opposition was mobilizing too. Richard Vandenberg and the Heritage Recovery Foundation held press conferences, gave interviews, hired expensive PR firms to shape the narrative. They painted Kellerman as a Nazi sympathizer who'd stolen Jewish property under the guise of protection. They pointed to the fact that he'd never returned anything, never contacted families, never made his repository public. If he was so noble, Vandenberg said in a television interview, why did he hide everything? Why the secrecy? Why did he take these treasures to his grave? I'll tell you why. Because he stole them. And now we have a woman, this Sarah Hartley, who's trying to profit from his theft by playing hero. The accusations hurt worse than Sarah could have imagined. She stopped watching the news. She stopped reading social media, but she couldn't escape it entirely. The whispers followed her everywhere. At Emma's school, a parent confronted her during pickup. "My husband says you're no better than a grave robber," the woman spat. "Profiting off the Holocaust. You should be ashamed." Sarah wanted to scream, to explain, to make them understand, but she just took Emma's hand and walked away, her daughter's confused questions stabbing her heart with every step. The worst came on a Friday evening. Sarah arrived home from work to find her duplex had been broken into. Nothing had been stolen, but everything had been destroyed. Furniture overturned, dishes smashed, clothes torn from closets and shredded, and on the wall, spray-painted in red, "Thief." Emma's room had been hit worst. Her books torn apart, her stuffed animals ripped open, her drawings crumpled and scattered. Sarah stood in the doorway of that small room and felt something inside her break. The sheriff came, took photos, wrote a report. "We'll investigate," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't expect to find anything. "You might want to consider relocating, for your safety and your daughter's." "I haven't done anything wrong," Sarah said, her voice hollow. The sheriff shrugged. "Doesn't matter what's true, matters what people believe, and right now, a lot of people believe you're getting rich off dead people's property. What happens next will test everything Sarah believes about justice and courage, expose the powerful forces trying to steal history itself, and prove whether one mother's determination can stand against wealth, lies, and the weight of the world pressing down. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. After the sheriff left, Sarah sat on the floor of Emma's destroyed room and finally let herself fall apart. She sobbed until her throat was raw, until she had no tears left, until she was empty of everything except exhaustion. Emma found her there an hour later. The girl had been staying with Miller and his wife, while Sarah dealt with the police. Now she stood in the doorway of her ruined room, small and quiet, taking in the destruction. "Mama," she said softly, "are we going to give up?" Sarah looked at her daughter through swollen eyes. "Do you want to give up?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "In the stories, the heroes don't give up. Even when the monsters seem too strong, they keep fighting because it's the right thing to do." Sarah pulled Emma into her lap, holding her tight. "This isn't a story, baby. This is real. People are angry, they're scared, and they're taking it out on us." "But we're doing the right thing," Emma insisted. "We're helping those families get their stuff back. That's good, right?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "That's good. Then we shouldn't give up." Sarah held her daughter and felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, the exhaustion, the anger, the sense of being overwhelmed. But underneath it all, beneath all the noise and chaos, was something solid, something that couldn't be spray-painted over or smashed or broken. Purpose. She had opened that door for a reason. She had found that vault for a reason. And maybe the reason wasn't about treasure or money or fame. Maybe it was simply this: to stand up when everyone else wanted to look away, to fight when fighting seemed impossible, to prove that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they just refused to quit. "Okay," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "We're not giving up, but we're not staying here either. It's not safe." That night, they packed what could be salvaged and moved into a motel on the edge of town. The room was small and smelled like bleach and old cigarettes, but the door had a deadbolt, and the clerk promised to call the police if anyone came looking for them. Sarah lay awake that night, Emma curled against her side and made plans. She would fight. She would document everything. She would work with David and Margaret and Dr. Hoffman. She would prove that Leopold Kellerman had been a hero, not a thief. That the vault was a sanctuary, not a crime scene. And she would make sure those families got their treasures back. The next morning, David called with news. The State Department has agreed to delay their inquiry. Dr. Hoffman's research made an impact. They're willing to let us conduct a full authentication and restitution process before making any decisions about seizure. That's good, right? Sarah asked. It's a start. But Sarah, we need to move fast. The Heritage Recovery Foundation is filing for an emergency injunction. They want a judge to seal the vault and freeze all access pending their lawsuit. If they succeed, everything stops. No more family visits, no more authentication, no more returns. Just lawyers and courts for years. Can they do that? If they find the right judge? Yes. We have a hearing scheduled for next Wednesday. Helena District Court. You need to be there. Wednesday came too fast. Sarah borrowed a suit from Margaret, navy blue and slightly too large, but professional enough. She left Emma with Miller's wife and drove the 2 hours to Helena with David, her stomach churning the entire way. The courthouse was old and imposing, all marble and dark wood. The courtroom itself was formal and cold, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. Richard Vandenberg sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. Sarah sat with David, feeling small and out of place. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Brennan. She listened to both sides present their arguments, her expression neutral, her questions sharp. Vandenberg's lead attorney, a man named Harrison Mills, spoke first. He painted a picture of chaos and mismanagement. He claimed Sarah was unqualified to handle items of such value. He suggested she was working with black market dealers to sell pieces illegally. He argued that the vault needed to be secured immediately for the protection of all potential claimants. Your Honor, Mills said, his voice smooth and confident. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in cultural treasures. Items that belong to the world, not to one small-town mechanic who stumbled upon them by accident. The Heritage Recovery Foundation has the expertise and resources to properly catalogue and secure this collection. Miss Hartley, with all due respect, does not. Then it was David's turn. He stood slowly, adjusted his tie, and spoke with a quiet intensity that filled the courtroom. Your Honor, this case isn't about expertise or resources. It's about rights and responsibilities. Sarah Hartley is the legal owner of the property where these items were found. She has not claimed ownership of the collection. She has cooperated fully with authorities. She has worked tirelessly to authenticate items and contact legitimate heirs. The Heritage Recovery Foundation, on the other hand, has no legal standing. They are not heirs. They are not representatives of the families. They are a private organization trying to seize control of property that doesn't belong to them. He presented Dr. Hoffman's research, the journals, the documentation proving Kellerman's intent. He showed photographs of families visiting the vault, testimony from descendants who'd been reunited with their heritage. The foundation claims to care about Holocaust survivors, David said, but their actions tell a different story. They're trying to prevent actual survivors and their descendants from reclaiming what's rightfully theirs. They're trying to turn a sanctuary into a commodity, and they're targeting Miss Hartley because she's vulnerable, because they think they can intimidate her into giving up. Judge Brennan listened to it all, taking notes, asking occasional questions. When both sides had finished, she sat back in her chair and was silent for a long moment. This is one of the more unusual cases I've encountered, she finally said, and it raises complex questions about property rights, international law, and cultural heritage. However, based on the evidence presented today, I'm not prepared to grant the Foundation's motion. Relief washed over Sarah so powerfully she thought she might faint. That said, the judge continued, I am ordering that the vault be formally documented and catalogued by neutral experts. I'm appointing a special master to oversee the authentication and restitution process, and I'm requiring regular reports to this court on the status of all claims. Miss Hartley, you will continue to have access to the property, but you will not remove or alter anything without approval from the special master. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah managed. Good. Mr. Mills, your client's claims remain active, but they will be adjudicated through proper channels, not through emergency seizure. We're adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Vandenberg and his lawyers left quickly, their faces tight with barely controlled anger. David squeezed Sarah's shoulder. We won, he said quietly. First round, at least. But Sarah barely heard him. She was watching Vandenberg's retreating back, seeing the way his hand clenched into a fist, the rigid set of his shoulders. She'd seen men look like that before, during the worst days of her divorce. Men who didn't accept losing, men who would find another way. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. That night, back at the motel, Sarah held Emma and tried to explain what had happened in terms a 9-year-old could understand. The judge said we can keep working. We can keep helping the families. The bad people didn't win. But they didn't lose either, Emma said, too perceptive for her age. No, Sarah admitted. They didn't lose. They'll keep trying. So we have to keep fighting. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm scared, Mama. Me too, baby, Sarah whispered. Me too. But fear, Sarah was learning, didn't have to mean surrender. Fear could exist alongside courage. You could be terrified and still choose to stand your ground. You could feel small and powerless and still refuse to quit. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Hoffman showed up at the motel with a cardboard box full of papers. I have found something, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. Something important. She spread the papers across the motel room's small table. They were letters, dozens of them, written in German and carefully translated. Letters between Leopold Kellerman and Otto Hoffmann, spanning from 1938 to 1952. Read this one, Dr. Hoffmann said, pointing to a letter dated April 1952, just 2 months before Kellerman's death. He knew he was dying. He knew he wouldn't finish the work. And he writes about what should happen to the repository if he dies before completing the restitution. Sarah read the faded typescript of the translation. The treasures must be returned to their rightful owners or their heirs. If no heirs can be found, items should be donated to appropriate cultural institutions with preference given to Holocaust museums and Jewish cultural organizations. Under no circumstances should the collection be sold for private profit. These items represent the last wishes of families who trusted me with their heritage. I will honor that trust even beyond death. This is his will, Sarah said, looking up, his intent in his own words. Exactly, Dr. Hoffmann said. This proves that Kellerman's purpose was always restitution, never profit. And it gives us a roadmap for what to do with items that have no identifiable heirs. David, who'd driven out when Dr. Hoffmann called, was photographing every page. This changes everything. We can use this to structure the entire restitution process. We can prove intent, demonstrate good faith, and protect against opportunistic claims. But Sarah was looking at the date on the letter. April 1952. Kellerman had died in June. He'd written this knowing he had weeks, maybe days left. He'd spent his final moments not protecting himself, but protecting the families who'd trusted him. He never gave up, she said softly. Right until the end, he was trying to do the right thing. Dr. Hoffmann nodded. That is who Leopold Kellerman was. A man who understood that some responsibilities transcend death. And now you, Sarah, you are helping him finally complete his mission. Sarah looked around the shabby motel room at these people who'd become her unexpected allies. Margaret Chen with her fierce dedication to history. David Chen with his refusal to back down from powerful adversaries. Dr. Hoffmann with her grandfather's journals and her lifetime of research. And Emma, asleep on the bed, who'd started all of this with her curiosity about a frozen Hobbit house. They were just ordinary people, a historian, a lawyer, an old academic, a mechanic, and a 9-year-old girl. Against them stood wealthy organizations, international interests, and forces that had kept secrets buried for 70 years. The odds were impossible. The opposition was overwhelming. The path forward was unclear. But Sarah had learned something in the weeks since opening that heavy wooden door. Sometimes the most important battles weren't won by the strongest or the richest or the most powerful. Sometimes they were won by the most stubborn, by people who simply refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. She thought about Kellerman, dying in that stone house, still protecting treasures that didn't belong to him. Still trying to honor promises to families who were already gone. Still believing that someday, someone would finish what he'd started. "Okay," Sarah said, looking at her unlikely team. "Let's finish what he started. Let's bring those treasures home." The breakthrough came on a grey March morning when Sarah least expected it. She was in the vault with the special master, a meticulous woman named Dr. Patricia Ross, who'd been appointed by Judge Brennan to oversee the authentication process. They were photographing items in Chamber 4 when Dr. Ross stopped suddenly, her flashlight beam fixed on a small case Sarah had passed dozens of times without really seeing. Inside was a leather portfolio, unmarked and unassuming. Dr. Ross opened the case carefully, her gloved hands gentle, and pulled out a stack of documents. Legal documents, notarized, stamped, official. "My God," Dr. Ross whispered. "These are transfer agreements, signed contracts between Kellerman and the families, each one legally assigning custody of the items to him for safekeeping with explicit instructions for return." Sarah moved closer, heart pounding. "What does that mean?" "It means Kellerman wasn't just morally right. He was legally right. These families gave him formal custody. He wasn't hiding stolen property. He was executing a legal trust." Dr. Ross was flipping through the documents, her excitement growing. "There are over 200 contracts here, signed between 1937 and 1942, witnessed, notarized. This is ironclad legal proof." David arrived within 2 hours of getting the call. He spent the rest of the day photographing every document, verifying signatures against historical records, cross-referencing names with the items in the vault. By evening, his case had gone from strong to unassailable. "The Heritage Recovery Foundation is finished," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "Vandenberg has been claiming Kellerman stole everything, but these contracts prove the families voluntarily entrusted their property to him. Any judge will see that." "What about the items with no contracts?" Sarah asked. "There are pieces in the vault that aren't covered by these agreements." "Those we'll handle case by case. But Sarah, this changes the fundamental nature of the dispute. You're not harboring stolen property. You're the custodian of a legitimate trust that's been waiting 70 years to be executed." The court hearing 3 weeks later was nothing like the first one. This time, Sarah walked into the courtroom with her head high, surrounded by her team. Dr. Hoffman had flown in from Vienna. Margaret had brought documentation from the Holocaust Museum. Dr. Ross presented her authentication reports, and David had prepared a presentation that methodically destroyed every claim Vandenberg had made. Judge Brennan listened as David walked her through the contracts, the documentation, the historical evidence. He showed photographs of families reuniting with their treasures. He presented testimony from descendants who'd spent their lives searching for these items. He proved beyond any doubt that Leopold Kellerman had been a guardian, not a thief. When Vandenberg's lawyer stood to respond, he had nothing. No evidence to counter the contracts, no proof to support his allegations. He tried to argue technicalities, to question the validity of 70-year-old documents, to suggest that international law superseded private agreements. But even as he spoke, Sarah could see he knew he'd lost. Judge Brennan didn't take long to decide. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm dismissing the Heritage Recovery Foundation's claims in their entirety. The contracts clearly establish that Mr. Kellerman was acting as a legal custodian. Miss Hartley, as the property owner, has the right and responsibility to continue that custodianship and to execute the restitution process as originally intended." She looked directly at Vandenberg. "Mr. Vandenberg, your organization has wasted this court's time and resources with frivolous claims. I'm ordering you to pay Miss Hartley's legal fees, and I'm referring your conduct to the Bar Association for review. If you file any further actions in this matter, I will hold you in contempt." The gavel came down. Sarah felt David's hand on her shoulder, felt Margaret hugging her from the other side, heard Emma cheering from the back of the courtroom where she'd been sitting with Miller's wife. But mostly she felt a weight lifting, a pressure that had been crushing her for months finally releasing its grip. They'd won, actually truly won. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. But this time Sarah didn't shy away. She stood on the steps with Emma beside her and spoke clearly. This was never about money. It was never about fame. It was about honoring the wishes of families who suffered unimaginable loss and trusted a good man to protect their heritage. Leopold Kellerman kept that trust for his entire life. Today, we're finally able to complete the work he started. A reporter shouted a question. What happens to the collection now? Sarah looked at David, who nodded encouragement. We're establishing the Kellerman Heritage Foundation. It will oversee the continued restitution of items to verified heirs. Items with no identifiable heirs will be donated to Holocaust museums and cultural institutions as Kellerman intended, and the vault itself will be preserved as an educational site, a reminder of what ordinary people can do to protect culture in the face of destruction. Will you profit from any of this? Sarah smiled, thinking about her empty bank account, the motel room she and Emma were still living in, the job at Miller's she'd returned to. The only profit I need is knowing those families got their history back. But that wasn't quite true. Because something else had happened during those months of fighting. The families Sarah had helped, the descendants who'd reunited with their heritage, they hadn't forgotten. They'd been meeting, talking, planning. 2 weeks after the court victory, Sarah received a letter signed by 43 families. They'd created a fund, pooled together from their own resources, to thank Sarah for her work. They'd raised enough money to cover her legal fees, her lost wages, and to provide a small stipend for her to continue overseeing the restitution process. But more than that, they'd established a position for her, director of the Kellerman Heritage Foundation. A real job with a real salary, managing the vault and working with families to identify and return their property. Sarah sat at the motel room table reading the letter over and over, tears streaming down her face. Emma climbed into her lap, reading over her shoulder. Does this mean we don't have to live in the motel anymore? Emma asked hopefully. Yeah, baby, Sarah managed. It means we can find a real home. They moved into a small house on the edge of Frost Ridge 3 weeks later. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom rental with a yard and a porch swing. But it was theirs. The landlord was Martha from the diner, who'd apologized for her earlier coldness by offering Sarah a lease at below market rate. I was wrong about you, Martha said as she handed over the keys. We all were, and this is my way of trying to make it right. The town had changed. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. People who'd whispered and accused now stopped Sarah on the street to apologize. The parent who'd confronted her at school pickup showed up at her door with a homemade pie and tears in her eyes. The sheriff who'd suggested she relocate now made a point of driving past her house twice a shift to make sure she was safe. Emma went back to school and found herself something of a celebrity. Kids wanted to hear about the vault, about the treasures, about the adventure. Miss Henderson invited Sarah to speak to the class about history and courage and the importance of doing the right thing even when it's hard. Miller gave Sarah a raise and a new title, senior mechanic. Should have done it months ago, he said gruffly. You're the best wrench I've got and everyone knows it now. But the biggest change came to the Hobbit house itself. The Kellerman Heritage Foundation, with donations from the families and grants from historical organizations, began transforming the site. The entrance was reinforced and made safe. The tunnels were lit with proper lighting. The chambers were climate-controlled and secured. Display cases were updated with information about each item, its history, the family it belonged to, and Sarah oversaw all of it, working with architects and historians and security experts to create something Kellerman would have been proud of. Not just a vault, but a living memorial, a place where people could come to understand what was lost during the war and what was saved by ordinary people with extraordinary courage. The grand opening of the Kellerman Heritage Center happened on a crisp October morning, 18 months after Sarah and Emma had first pushed open that heavy wooden door. Hundreds of people came, families who'd reclaimed their property, Holocaust survivors and their descendants, historians and educators, government officials and media from around the world. And the town of Frost Ridge turned out in force. The same people who'd once whispered and mocked now filled the chairs set up in the field outside the entrance. They came because they'd learned something important, that history wasn't something distant and abstract. It was real and personal, and sometimes it was hiding right in their own backyard, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. Sarah stood at the podium with Emma beside her and looked out at the crowd. She saw Margaret Chen and Dr. Hoffman sitting together in the front row. She saw David with his wife and new baby. She saw Miller and Martha and the sheriff and Miss Henderson and dozens of other faces from town, people who'd doubted and then believed, who'd turned away and then come back. 18 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady. My daughter asked if we could explore an old building. I almost said no. I was tired. I was scared. I was barely holding my life together. But Emma was curious, and sometimes curiosity is the most important thing we can give our children. The courage to ask questions, the freedom to explore, the belief that something extraordinary might be hiding behind an ordinary door. She paused, looking down at Emma, who squeezed her hand. What we found changed our lives. But more importantly, it changed the lives of families around the world. People who thought their history was lost forever. People who carried the weight of not knowing what happened to their family's treasures. We gave them answers. We gave them closure. We gave them their heritage back. Sarah gestured to the entrance behind her, where the words carved in stone 78 years ago still stood. 1947. What we preserve, we honor. Leopold Kellerman understood something that took me a long time to learn. That the things worth preserving aren't always valuable in dollars or famous in history books. Sometimes they're just important to one family, one person, one story, and that's enough. That's everything. She looked out at Ruth Goldberg, now 84 years old, who'd traveled from New York to be there. Ruth stood slowly, holding up the silver menorah that had belonged to her grandmother, the one she'd wept over in the vault all those months ago. This is why we preserve, Sarah said, her voice catching. Not for museums or collectors or monetary value, but for moments like this, for connections that span generations, for memories that survive even when people don't. The old man from Prague was there too, seated in a wheelchair now, but smiling. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, and Sarah saw the ring on his finger, the one his grandfather had made in a shop that no longer existed, in a city that had tried to forget its Jewish heritage. The ring had survived because Leopold Kellerman had believed it mattered. And now it was home. After the speeches and the ribbon cutting, after the first tours had gone through and the crowd had thinned, Sarah found herself alone in the entrance chamber with Emma. The girl was running her hands over the stone walls, remembering. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "do you ever wish we hadn't opened the door? That we'd just stayed in our normal life?" Sarah thought about the past year and a half, the threats and the lawsuits, the broken-into duplex and the spray-painted accusations, the sleepless nights and the moments when she'd been ready to quit, the fear and the doubt and the crushing weight of fighting battles too big for one person. But she also thought about Ruth Goldberg's tears, about the old man from Prague finally keeping his grandmother's promise, about the 43 families who'd written to thank her, about Dr. Hoffman showing her grandfather's journals, about standing in this chamber surrounded by treasures that represented both the worst and best of humanity. "No," Sarah said honestly, "I wouldn't change it, because we were part of something bigger than ourselves. We helped people heal. We honored the dead by caring for what they left behind, and we learned something important." "What's that?" Emma asked. "That ordinary people can do extraordinary things. We're not rich or powerful or special. We're just a mum and a daughter who asked questions and refused to give up. And somehow, that was enough." Emma smiled, then said something that made Sarah's heart swell. "I want to be like you when I grow up, someone who does the right thing even when it's scary." Sarah pulled her daughter close. "You already are, baby. You already are." Over the next year, the Kellerman Heritage Center became more than anyone had imagined. Schools brought students to learn about World War II, about the Holocaust, about the ordinary people who'd risked everything to save culture from destruction. Families continued to come forward with claims, and Sarah worked with each one patiently, verifying, authenticating, returning. Of the original collection, nearly 70% was returned to verified heirs. Another 20% went to Holocaust museums and Jewish cultural centers around the world. The remaining 10%, items with no traceable owners or descendants, formed the core of a permanent exhibition at the center. Frost Ridge transformed too. What had been a dying town became a destination. Tour buses brought visitors, hotels opened, restaurants thrived. The local high school created a history program in partnership with the center. Jobs came back. Young people stayed instead of leaving, and at the heart of it all was the woman who'd once been mocked for inheriting an old hangar, the single mother mechanic who'd stumbled into history and chosen to honor it. Sarah Hartley became someone people pointed to with pride instead of suspicion, but Sarah herself remained remarkably unchanged. She still wore coveralls more often than dresses. She still had grease under her fingernails. She still drove the same old Suburban. The only difference was confidence, a quiet assurance that came from knowing she'd faced the worst and survived. That she'd been tested and hadn't broken. Emma grew too. She started volunteering at the center, giving tours, telling visitors about the day she'd first wanted to explore the Hobbit house. She talked about the families she'd met, the stories she'd heard, the way history wasn't just dates and facts, but real people with real lives. One evening, 3 years after that first discovery, Sarah stood on the porch of their little house, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. Emma was inside doing homework, the radio playing softly. From somewhere down the street came the sound of children playing, of life happening in all its ordinary beauty. Margaret Chen pulled up in her car, waving as she got out. She'd become a regular visitor, a friend beyond just a professional colleague. They sat together on the porch swing, rocking gently. "I have news," Margaret said. "The International Council of Museums wants to give you an award for your work with the restitution process. It's a very prestigious honor." Sarah smiled. "That's nice. But honestly, the real honor was just being part of it. Getting to see those families reunite with their heritage. That's worth more than any award." Margaret nodded. "I know, but Sarah, you need to understand what you've accomplished. You've changed the way the world thinks about wartime preservation. You've set a new standard for how to handle discoveries like this. You've proven that ordinary citizens can be trusted with extraordinary responsibilities." "I just did what Kellerman would have wanted," Sarah said. "I finished what he started." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "You did more than that. Kellerman preserved the past, but you brought it back to life. You gave it meaning and purpose. You turned a vault of treasures into a bridge between generations." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day fade. Then Emma came out, announcing dinner was ready with the enthusiasm of a 12-year-old who'd discovered she liked cooking. As they ate together, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a broken marriage and an empty bank account to this, a home, a purpose, a life that mattered. She thought about all the moments when she could have quit, when quitting would have been easier, when everyone expected her to fail. But she'd kept going. Not because she was particularly brave or strong or special, just because she'd looked at Emma and remembered that the most important lessons children learn aren't from what we say, but from what we do. From watching us choose courage over comfort, integrity over convenience, purpose over profit. That night after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah walked across the frozen field one last time. The center was closed, dark except for security lights. She used her key to enter, descended the stone steps, and stood in the entrance chamber where it all began. The walls were the same stone Kellerman had laid 78 years ago. The air still held that quality of preservation, of things protected and honored. But now it wasn't silent. Now it hummed with the energy of hundreds of visitors each week, of stories told and memories shared, of history kept alive. Sarah touched the stone wall, feeling the cold beneath her palm. "We did it," she whispered to the ghost of a man she'd never met, but felt she knew. "We brought them home." She thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this place, the families who'd reclaimed their heritage, the students who'd learned about courage and sacrifice, the town that had found new purpose. Emma, who'd learned that curiosity and determination could change the world, and herself, a woman who'd been broken by divorce and poverty and loss, who'd rebuilt herself through grit and grace and the simple act of refusing to give up. Sarah Hartley had bought a crumbling property for 75 cents, expecting nothing. She'd found $275 million worth of treasure. But the real treasure, the one that changed everything, wasn't in the display cases or the restored artifacts. It was in the lesson that ordinary people matter, that small acts of courage ripple outward in ways we can't imagine, that doing the right thing, even when it's terrifying and thankless and impossibly hard, is always worth it in the end. Because sometimes the girl who explores the frozen Hobbit house becomes the woman who changes the world. Sometimes the mother who says yes instead of no opens doors that needed opening. Sometimes the mechanic with grease under her nails becomes the guardian of history itself. Anyone can change the world if they're curious enough to ask questions, brave enough to seek answers, and stubborn enough to fight for what's right, even when everyone says it's impossible. As Sarah walked back across the frozen field toward her little house with the porch swing, toward the daughter who was waiting and the life they'd built together, she understood something profound. The treasure had never been about gold or paintings or priceless artifacts. The treasure was this: the knowledge that she'd honored the past, helped the present, and given Emma a future built on courage instead of fear. The frozen Hobbit house still stood on the edge of town, its stone walls holding stories that would outlive them all. But now those stories were being told. Now the families were coming home. Now the world knew that even in the darkest times, there were people who chose preservation over destruction, who chose compassion over profit, who chose to honor what was entrusted to them. Leopold Kellerman had been one of those people. And 78 years later, a single mother and her curious daughter had proven that his choice, his sacrifice, his unwavering dedication to doing right had mattered after all. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories are waiting for you. Click to continue the journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that ordinary courage can create extraordinary change.